In this video, we're going to talk about how we can create and manage Active Directory sites in Active Directory. Now, Active Directory sites are really important in Active Directory so that people can access the closest resources to them. For instance, what we have here is a small environment of 3 different locations. In this particular scenario, we have a data center in Seattle, and then 2 office buildings, one in Los Angeles and one in New York. And what we want is so that if a laptop user comes in and goes into the Los Angeles office, they should be accessing the Los Angeles resources, such as the Los Angeles domain controller, Los Angeles file servers, and other resources specific to Los Angeles. However, if they pick up and they jump on an airplane and they fly up to Seattle, well, then they should be accessing the Seattle resources, the Seattle domain controllers, the Seattle file servers, and so on. And then lastly, if they pick up again and fly all the way over to New York, well, they should access the New York resources. Now, Active Directory Sites does all this and finds out which location these machines are in by use of IP subnets. Now, in this case, we had a very intelligent person planning out the subnets, and they actually did it very nicely in the fact that they're using /16s for the entire site. So it's very easy to notice that 10.1 is Seattle, 10.2 is New York, and 10.3 is Los Angeles. Anything inside of those /16s, so all the /24s that might exist inside of those, are also parts of those sublocations, but we now have one supernet that helps identify the entire location as one simple item. Well, let's check out to see how we might be able to set this up in our environment. So I have here my Active Directory domain controller, and I'm going to go ahead and just open up my sites. So under in Server Manager, I'm going to go up to Tools, Active Directory, Sites and Services. By default, there will be one default site and one default site transport that is available to me. And I want to go ahead and create a new site transports to be able to specify these various locations. First thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and start off by renaming this default first site. I'm just going to right click, rename, and I'll call this Seattle, because why not? At the same time, I'm going to come up here. No, actually, I'll leave this one blank for right now. But what I do want to do is I also want to specify the Seattle subnet. So I'm going to right click on subnets, new subnet, and Seattle was 10.1.0.0/16. Typo there, 10.1. And then I specify the site for it, and I click OK. At this point, any machine that comes in with an IP address in the 10.1.0.0/16 range will be assumed to be part of the Seattle subnet. All right, let's create a new site. So I'm just going to right click on sites, say new site. Let's go ahead and do New York first. So I'll go ahead and do New York. I do have to specify a site name, so I'm just going to go ahead and choose this default site link first. We'll rename that shortly. Tells me, great, go ahead and add your subnets. Make sure you have domain controllers in all those locations. That's good. While that's going, I'm going to go ahead and add the New York subnets. So that's 10.2.00/16 and specify that as being New York. And then lastly, let's go ahead and create the LA site. Again, I'll change the site link here in just a minute. Create the new subnets, 10.3.0.0/16 for Los Angeles. All right, so now I have 3 different locations, Seattle, New York, and LA, and they all have associated subnets with them. And it's nice and easy. Now when a user comes in and they get an IP address in one of these ranges, they are automatically associated with one of these sites. They will then begin to use the domain controllers in that site and any other resources associated with it. Now, the next thing I want to do, now that I've gone ahead and done this, is I want to look back at my diagram, and I see I have Well, two different site links. I have one connecting Seattle to New York and one connecting Seattle to LA. So I want to create two different site links so to define what that actually means. So I'm going to create one called, very obviously, Seattle to LA, and then another one, Seattle to New York. And I'm going to then tie those sites together appropriately. So come back in here. We go back to our intersite transports, the IP type. SMTP is an option. However, never actually seen anybody use email for their site links, but it is still a possibility. I'm actually going to right click on this default site link and I'm going to rename this just because it's already there. And I'm going to call that one Seattle to Los Angeles. Now that I've got the Seattle to Los Angeles site link, let's go ahead and create a new one. So another right click, new site link, and I'll call this one Seattle to New York. And I'll specify the Seattle and New York links, add, and OK. And now that I've done that, I do actually have to come back here and I have to edit my Los Angeles one and remove Seattle out of there. So what this means, very briefly, is I've created the Seattle to Los Angeles link, and the only sites that will replicate across it are Seattle. Chose the wrong one. Excuse me. Seattle and Los Angeles will replicate between these two links. Vice versa, the New York link, Seattle to New York, Seattle will replicate to New York. No direct link exists between Los Angeles and New York. Therefore, I'm able to help control and manage my traffic going between the sites accordingly. While I'm here, I can modify the cost, replication schedule, replication frequency, and even the schedule. However, in many cases, we will normally leave those blank. Okay, so lastly, when I create new servers, if I create them in the 10.1, 10.2, or 10.3 ranges, they will automatically get dropped into the appropriate subnets. However, if I have existing servers such as DC1 that should have actually been in New York, well, we can actually drag and drop that into New York to move that into the correct location. Once it's there, it will stay there. So we do have to occasionally manually move these around. But when we create new, they automatically go into the correct location. Now, lastly, there may be situations where I have multiple servers, say in New York, or multiple servers in Seattle or Los Angeles, and I want all the replications to come into one specific server. In this case, maybe DC1. And so I want to specify all replications going into New York, in this case, would go into DC1, as opposed to into DC2 or DC3 that might also be in that range. So for that, we would come back into the intersite transports, and I would choose my site link that has New York in it. Go ahead and edit the properties here. Correction. There we go. Yeah, correction. We right click on the server itself and we go into the properties. It then has here on the general tab, we can specify which transports we want this to be called a bridgehead server for, which means all communication across site links will go to this, and then it will be responsible for disseminating information inside the site. So I can go ahead and specify, yes, for the IP transports, go ahead and allow this guy to be the bridgehead, and then say OK. And now all communications from Seattle to New York will go through DC1, and then DC1, once other servers are there, will begin disseminating out to all the others, as opposed to having multiple WAN replications at the same time. One last thing to note is these site links and site IP ranges are extremely important. We've gone ahead and we've defined 3 ranges, 10.1, 10.2, and 10.3. Let's say the New York area grows and grows and grows, and our networking team decides, you know what, I'm going to add 10.4 to New York. And they do this without telling the Windows admins. Or at least the Windows admins don't necessarily log into the fact or recognize the fact that means they have to change their site ranges. That means that if a new PC or laptop or somebody else comes in line, horrible pictures there. If a new PC comes online and gets a new IP address in the 10.4.5.27 IP range, what's going to happen is it's going to look up there. 10.4, if it's not put into the IP ranges, it won't know if it's supposed to be in New York. It will then look in Seattle, not know if it's supposed to be there, look in Los Angeles, not know where it's supposed to be. And it may or may not randomly choose one of those. So even though it may physically be sitting in New York City, because of the fact that the IP ranges are not configured in my sites, means it may accidentally go across the WAN links all the way down to Los Angeles to access resources. Therefore, it's important to maintain these site links, IP ranges once you have defined them.